Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at some study MIDI. What is study MIDI? Well, I grabbed some MIDI files from Ben Botkin on his site, and he has a little PDF that gives some suggestions for how to make things your own, as well as some tips and tricks on what he did in his process there. You get an MP3 file. He's got a free video walking through the piece from his perspective. And then you can just put your own instruments on it. Let's take a listen and just hear how my mix is sounding. It's kind of a rough mix, kind of thrown together. I'm just sort of finishing things up. I still may want to change things, but it kind of reflects my sensibilities, which are a little different than the way that it was originally mixed. But mostly I'm interested in learning the composition. And so there's some really interesting takeaways about how things are written, how things get performed, how he performed the little lines. Like there's just a little bit of alto flute here, and a little flute and oboe here, and one little horn line here, and just one little bell tree here. And you know, as you add things, it's interesting to kind of deconstruct all these little parts and pieces and hear how they got performed. It's a really rich piece of music. All right, I've said enough. Let's check out the way this mix sounds. All right, yeah, so one of the fun things is kind of hearing how someone else treated all of that writing. Really the writing is, I mean, the performance is very interesting, and you can study how to make things convincing and realistic, and how different people organize their MIDI. You can see that there's legatos are up here, and then the sustains are down here. And Soaring Strings comes with full dynamic range and soft dynamic range sustains, so he used both. I had about, if you look at all the tracks that load up, I had about half of the same instruments, and for the other half I had to figure out what I had that was going to work. So I have Soaring Strings, and this was written as a Soaring Strings demo. It's called Commanding the Fleet. And so the strings are going to sound similar. One of the first things I did was change some of the EQ and cello parts, and did some of my own things right off the bat. So they're not going to sound identical, and that wasn't really my goal. It depends on what you want to study. What do you want to study, you know? And then I didn't have Berlin woodwinds, so I used Cinematic Studio woodwinds, CSW. And there's a couple places where I wonder if replaying it or changing the way that the note attacks were would have made them more compatible with CSWs. That's a question you want to ask yourself. Were these played in such a way to make Berlin woodwinds act a certain way, and would they need to be played a different way for CSW? I used the Marcato articulation for these fast runs, which are usually kind of right on time, but they kind of sound a little weird out of time, which may have sounded perfect on Berlin woodwinds. I don't know. Then I do have Arc 1, so half of these brass, a little more than half I was able to get, but then he has some Cinebrass that I didn't have. I do have Hollywood, so I was able to get that Hollywood brass 6 French horn legato. And I used Junkie XL for these trombones, and I split them into long and shorts because he's using Cinebrass, which is kind of more of a performance patch, I gather, where you can play shorts and then longs together in one patch. I guess I could have used Angry Brass too. I didn't have any of this percussion, none of it. I don't know if he had a Spitfire harp or if I retitled that Spitfire harp. Cineperk I didn't have, Berlin percussion I didn't have, VSL tubular bells I didn't have, so all of this percussion section is completely replaced. What did I replace it with? A lot of it is True Strike, Cineperk, True Strike, and just the main first package, which is a really great deal. And the rest is Abbey Road orchestral foundations. I think I used that for the timpani and this bass drum. And a couple of them I actually used both. So I used xylophone and glockenspiel. I was actually doubling up to get more of a hybrid sound. And then on the bottom we've got, for the harp, I do think I used a Spitfire harp, but I may have retitled this track. I think I'm using just the free BBC harp, the Discover BBC harp. And then I do have Arc 1 again, so I was able to get the choirs exactly the same. But I mixed them differently a little bit, just a touch. So one of the fun things is kind of hearing all of the strings just on their own and just soloing out the sections once you get a piece like this. And right there, you can really feel what's missing when you don't hear that oboe in there. So let's put that oboe back in. And I think trumpet didn't come in just yet. Yeah, the trumpets start. Got a timpani coming in here. This was tricky for me because I think I was using the Abbey Road timpani, and it's got basically a very big break between the lower dynamic levels and the louder dynamic levels. Kind of goes from quiet to super loud, super fast, so I actually adjusted a lot of the velocities. I didn't mind the tone. I liked it a little better than some of the other timpanis I had. I have a nice Rhapsody, that Rhapsody percussion. It's quite good, and the timpani had a lot of tone. True Strike's timpani was pretty good too. Getting these crash cymbals right was a real tough one. I finally settled on a product from Waves Factory, I think, called Suspended Cymbals. When it said Zildjian, I went to that Zildjian right away, and I think I changed over to the smallest cymbal on the left. But yeah, it's tough getting someone else's cymbals just right if you're trying to copy them. So in the end, I didn't try to copy. I just had to go for like, this sounds fine. The Piatti, though, was probably Abbey Road again. This little crash here. Obviously that was a different one, different cymbal from Abbey Road. The tam-tam cymbal is this big, huge C. It said 85 centimeters. So I picked a nice big one. I wasn't sure. It was kind of hard to hear exactly what was happening in there, in the kind of the original audio. It was kind of underneath. So I used a nice big one just to give some mellow bigness down there. And then we've got another scrape here. This there was a scrape. That was what I found, and I found it in a Spitfire Scrapes library, I believe. There is one little patch that can do this, and this is kind of what I heard in the audio. So I figured it was close enough to create this effect. You put all these together. And there's a lot of low end you can hear in there. I'm adding some low end with some of the way that I'm processing the entire drum bus. So that's maybe something that I'd look at, taking out some of the low end from that if I wanted to, if I started getting really detailed. It's pretty boomy down there. On the other hand, sometimes a little bit of low end kind of helps. Maybe that, even though it came from a cymbal and not a bass drum, you know. Let's see what it sounds like with the timpani. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I like it that way. So the Zildjian is here. Let's just do these two. So here's the Zildjian. And it had a nice kind of shimmer at the top. So this is just a couple MIDI CCs down. And a couple MIDI CCs higher, it gets a lot brighter. And so I was playing with that for a while. And then into the crash cymbals, the Piatti. And if you're getting really picky, you can hear that they're not really the same room or the same kit or the same, you know. I'm putting everything into cinematic rooms, just one of the large scoring stage presets. And so that's another thing that's going to be different, is your reverb is going to be different if you're using different libraries. So these were some of the things that I found interesting. His tubular bells from VSL were... it looked like they were maybe hit with a wooden mallet. And boy, I did not figure out how to get them sounding the same. So mine sound like pretty typical tube bells, which is more dong. And his were kind of chimey. I almost could have used a glockenspiel. I added this kind of like tink at the top, just to kind of get a little bit more tinkle sound out of it. There's a triangle, I think, during this section too. And maybe the anvil, some of this stuff, break drums, so that you can kind of get this, you know, magical. Well, the triangle doesn't come in yet. Let's see. Yeah, break drums. So that even the break drums were like, what does this break drum sound like? Maybe some of the sound we were hearing was his break drums, because I don't know what that Berlin percussion anvil sounds like. So this is what I did for it. I don't even know if it's technically an anvil that I'm playing, or a breakdown. I just played something that kind of sounded like what he had. And then, yeah, and you get to hear how the vocal playing gets kind of mixed, meaning how he performed the vocals. I don't want to give too much away because I want you to be able to grab the MIDI yourself if you're interested in playing it. But that's one of the interesting performance things that I found. And you see that by looking at whether or not it's volume that's getting automated or a mod wheel or something else. So anyway, I just thought that I'd share this with you and encourage people if they're looking for ways of exploring their libraries and don't want to write something and just want to hear how their libraries sound with some well-constructed pieces of music. These things are out there, and you can download someone else's well-constructed MIDI. Not, one of the problems with MIDI downloads is that you'll get something maybe from a notation program and it's all perfectly quantized and all of the automation is messed up and not the right thing for your instruments and you have to delete it all. And all the velocities are kind of all over the place with a weird, like, everything's the same velocity when it's piano and everything's a different velocity when it's fortissimo, and you kind of have to reperform all of it anyway. This gives you a big leap forward, where most of what you're looking at is how the parts fit together, maybe replacing some instruments, maybe explore maybe build a template out of this, or start a template and start figuring out what kind of settings you want for quote-unquote balancing or gain staging your template. Gain staging obviously is when you are just sort of setting the levels for everything and making sure that all the levels are appropriate on the way into your mixing chain and throughout your mixing chain if you're going into effects or anything. I'm processing this, I would say, quite a bit because it's more my sensibility to get a little bit of a hybrid sound and get kind of an even. It gets pretty loud at the end. I let the brass really take over at the end, but I tend to compress a little bit more because I'm used to writing for TV. And I tend to notice that the stuff that gets used has a narrower dynamic range than a regular classical recording. The stuff that gets used tends to be a little flatter dynamically because the volume is being automated by the mixing engineer, mixing it under dialogue and back up, and they really just want to be able to control the volume themselves. They don't want necessarily your piece to just suddenly get really loud. And so they actually tend, not a stick of butter, but preserve some dynamics without. It's kind of a tricky balance of preserving just enough dynamics to make sense, but it tends to be a little bit flatter than maybe a concert recording would have been, where it gets really quiet during the quiet sections and stays really loud during the loud sections. Anyway, those are some things that I encourage you to check out, and I hope that you had a good time watching this and enjoy.